Hi guys, thank you for all coming today to our opening event, which we're very excited about for the Women in Architecture 2019-2020 lecture series. I wanted to give a warm welcome to Dr. Virginia Valian, who is a distinguished professor at Hunter College, where she directs Hunter's Language Acquisition Research Center and also the Gender Equity Project. Go check it out. Dr. Valian is the author of Why So Slow? The Advancement of Women, among other publications, and will be discussing her work and research on the reasons behind women's slow advancement in the professions and what individuals and institutions can do about it. I'm super excited that there's a variety of people here because this is something that affects everybody. Women, men, everybody. All right. Anyway. So the Women in Architecture group asked Virginia here today as our kickoff speaker because we felt the term unconscious bias is one that we all hear a lot about, but we don't really have any formal training in identifying with it, dealing with it, or even understand what the term encompasses. One of the things we acknowledge that while this lecture is in no way training on the topic, we hope that by having Virginia and all of our other invited guests who will be in this series this year, they can all speak to their understanding in relationship to unconscious bias so that we can start to all become conscious of it. And therefore change our own behaviors and affect change in others. One quick plug for the Women in Architecture breakfast series. We'll be starting next week. You will receive an email. So please all participate. We're really excited. That's where we're all going to, in small breakfasts, continue this conversation. So without further ado, because I know Virginia has a lot to share, I will open the floor up to her. And at the end, we'll have about 10 minutes for questions. So please welcome Virginia.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here. I live in buildings. I have a lot of experience with buildings as a consumer, so I'm always happy to meet the people who create them. In 1998, I published a book titled Why So Slow? The Advancement of Women. And 21 years later, I'm still asking that question, even though there's been measurable progress. I'm sure you're all aware of the data about women and men in architecture, but in case you're not, I thought I would just review from the New York Times article that you probably all read that came out last December. Just out of curiosity, how many of you did read that article? Okay, mostly the people in the front, which is interesting. Okay, so let me tell you what that article said so that we're all operating from the same idea of whether nationally and globally speaking there's any kind of issue with respect to men and women in architecture. So women account for half of the graduates from architecture programs, but they make up about 20% of licensed architects and 17% of partners or principals. Female and minority architects and designers earn less money than their white male peers. They're less likely to hold positions of leadership. And women are underrepresented not just at the top, but at all levels of practice. So in 2015 and 2016, only 31% of full or part-time faculty members in architecture were women. Okay, so that summary of how things are in architecture could, if we just changed the field names, hold for law, hold for business, hold for academia. So the kind of problem that we're addressing is a problem that does not respect profession. It happens across all the professions. And it happens especially lately with respect to who occupies positions of leadership, who is invited to speak at important conferences. My colleagues at Rice and I looked at gender differences in colloquium speakers. And do you have speakers? Do you have people who come and give colloquia? So not special to women, but, okay. Has anybody analyzed who those people are? Gender and ethnicity wise? So you could.
I mean, we did like a quick analysis, and like last year, we brought 6 or 7 lecture series for the women architecture group. We brought 75% of the women who spoke at Grimshaw, New York office.
I see,
So
okay.
we were bringing lion's share in with 6 or 7 people. That's not a great number.
Okay.
It's not very qualified.
Okay, so that is something that you could analyze, how many of your speakers are women and people of color. In the study that my colleagues and I did, we looked at colloquium speakers at 50 prestigious US colleges and universities, and we analyzed 3,600 plus talks that were given at those universities. And we discovered that controlling for prestige, controlling for age, and a number of other factors, men were more likely to be asked to give talks, to actually appear as speakers than women were. We separately asked men and women how they felt about the importance of giving talks, and men and women rated the importance of giving talks equally highly. We also asked them how likely were they to accept talk invitations, and again, there was no difference between men and women. So that was our attempt to determine whether women were choosing not to be significant in their field. That's become a popular explanation as explanations adverting to ability have declined, so people aren't saying so much anymore that women aren't as smart as men or aren't as talented as men. Rather, the conversation has shifted so that women aren't as interested as men in having a major career. At this point, a wonderful quote from Jeremy McClellan, the comedian. I don't know if any of you know him. There's a video clip of this. So he's addressing the gender wage gap, and he says, men naturally gravitate toward higher paying professions like doctor or engineer or CEO. Whereas women, this is true, just naturally gravitate toward lower paying professions like female doctor and female engineer and female CEO. So the idea that women don't want to be rich and famous is an idea that I think we need to retire. Now, one reason we need to retire it is that it overlooks the extent to which the environment plays a role in what occupations and levels of occupation people think they can achieve, and whether they think there's room for them in that field. An experiment with undergraduates put men or women students in a classroom to assess their interest in computer science, and they changed the ambiance of the classroom so that there were either Star Wars posters and empty Coke cans around, or there were nature posters and empty water bottles around. Women showed more interest in taking a course in computer science when there were nature posters and water bottles compared to Star Wars posters and empty food cans. So very subtle aspects of the environment affect what interests people think they can pursue. Now, we can ask, how early does the undervaluation of women, which culminates in their lower representation, their lower salary, and so on, how early does that undervaluation occur? And here I want to tell you about a study looking at mothers and their 11-month-old babies. One reason this study is important is that people often think that, okay, I'm going to tell you about this study, and then I see your food is here. And after I tell you about this study, I'll break so that you can get some food, and then we'll come back. This study looked at the ability of infants to climb up an inclined plane. And they could adjust the plane to make it steeper or shallower. And the mothers were asked what degree of tilt they thought their babies would be able to navigate. And mothers of boys significantly overestimated what degree of tilt their babies could navigate, and mothers of girls significantly underestimated what degree of tilt they could navigate. And they knew that because they then put the babies on these inclined slopes, and they saw what the babies would attempt and what they wouldn't attempt. Mothers thought their boy babies would attempt degrees of slope that 100% of the boy babies did not attempt, and they thought their girl babies would not attempt slopes that 100% of the girls did actually attempt. So one reason that this study is important is that we tend to think that if we know enough about somebody, we stop paying attention to their gender, their race, their ethnicity, their sexual orientation. We see them just as a person. And that's called individuating information by psychologists. What this study shows is that even when you have a lot of individuating information about somebody, so mothers have a lot of information about their babies, they are still affected by their ideas of what boys and girls will do and can do at any given time. So we project, even mothers who love their babies and want them to do the best they possibly can, we project onto them some things that are true of the groups. So boys will become more motorically advanced than girls will, but they're not more motorically advanced at age 11 months. And we project onto them some things that are very minor differences, like math, interest, and ability. And we create the differences that we attribute. So unlike the flat world hypothesis, which you can learn isn't the case, and you can't make the world flat because you believe it's flat, you can make children into different kinds of people based on what you think they can be. And you can make grown-ups different kinds of people based on what you think they can be. So part of the issue here is our projection of gender differences, some of which are minor, some of which don't exist at all, onto the men and women whom we see. Where does that come from? I'm going to tell you after we get something to say. Okay, so what we want to explain is a big range of phenomena. We want to explain why women make less money than men, why women are invited less to give prestigious talks, even when there are women there to be invited. We want to understand why mothers and fathers underestimate their children's abilities depending on their gender. We want to understand that entire network. And we also want to understand why it is that in almost every experiment I could tell you about that looks at impressions of men and women, there are no differences in how men and women respond. So women and men have the same views of women and men if you query them in a subtle way rather than an overt way. So what we want to understand is the ubiquity of these phenomena, and that is where the explanation that I offer comes in. So my explanation is a purely cognitive explanation. And it relies on the notion of schemas, which are shorthand schematic ways that we have of representing categories. So I have a schema for, I'm trying to think of a good thing to use here, a conference room. I have a schema of a conference room. This room is good. It fits my schema of a conference room. If we were doing it out there, it wouldn't be so good. So we all have schemas about everything. And psychologists, cognitive psychologists, study people's concepts in schematic form. We also have schemas about social roles and social identities. So we all have schemas about what it means to be male and what it means to be female. And both men and women have these schemas to roughly the same extent. There's much more variation within a gender than there is between genders. So I'm speaking in a very binary way here, in part because the experiments that I can tell you about assume a binary division. I don't want you to think I subscribe to a binary division, but I will be using the terms men and women in a fairly binary way. So how do schemas represent men and how do they represent women? They represent men in general as capable of independent action or agentic, as getting down to the task at hand or task-oriented, and as doing things for a reason or instrumental. So men are agentic, task-oriented, and instrumental. Our schemas represent women as nurturant, communal, and expressive of their feelings. So these are, even though we know all the sexes have all of those qualities, we primarily attribute to men the three qualities that I mentioned, and we primarily attribute to women the three qualities that I mentioned. So if we now think about your schema of what an architect is, you can ask which schema is most congruent with the schema of architect. Is it the schema of a man or is it the schema of a woman? I don't know what you think. My guess is that you think the schema that you have of an architect is more congruent with the schema you have of men. Is that true? Would you say? Okay, good. Now, our beliefs about gender differences are to some extent conscious, but to a large extent not conscious. we create some of these differences, we're very attuned to some of these differences. We see gender everywhere. So if I said to you, one gender is more likely to take baths than the other gender. Okay, you maybe never thought about it, but if I asked you, so let me ask you, which gender do you think is more likely to take baths?
Me.
Yeah.
You're looking for women, but I mean
Okay, so that's interesting because you knew what I was pulling for. So you know what the stereotype is, regardless of what your personal experience might be. So yes, I know somebody who spends 3 hours a day in the tub because he has a bad back. So that can happen, but you know what the stereotype or the schema is. Okay, now, some of that belief is non-conscious. So now I'm gonna say a few words about unconscious bias, a term I never use. And the reason I never use it is that I don't know exactly what's meant by it. And I don't like the term bias because it suggests there's something wrong with you if you're biased. So that's why I like the term schema, because it doesn't have the negative connotations that stereotype has, and it acknowledges the common cognitive underlying mechanism that's at work there. So I believe that schemas are inherently neutral, but they get affect or attitude attached to them. But this idea that you're looking at your world, you're trying to make sense out of it, you see a division in you see a difference in the division of labor, and you create hypotheses to explain that division. And that's where schemas come from. So what can we do to alter those schemas? And what are some of the ways that schemas come up in our everyday life that we could do something about? Schemas are very, very difficult to change. My own schemas, and I've been working on this issue for quite some time, my own schemas are alive and well. One day I went to Staples. I wanted to ask about a particular computer peripheral, whether or not they had it. There were 2 salespeople in the department, a man, a woman, and it was all I could do to look equally at the woman and the man when I was asking the question. My natural tendency was to look at the man. Now, they didn't have it. The woman said right away they didn't have it. The man took quite a long time to explain to me that they didn't have it. So I wasn't exactly rewarded for my efforts, but I give you that example as a way to say you are not going to eradicate your schemas anytime soon. And what that means is you need procedures and policies that will help protect you from the effects of those schemas. But you can also make a big effort to change your behavior, even if the underlying schemas aren't changing. So one example that people give as frequently now as they did 20 years ago is the example of the meeting where a woman, let's say Amy, makes a comment. Nobody pays any attention to it. 10 minutes later, what's your name?
Pass. See you.
Cass says the same thing, and everybody says, Cass, what a great idea.
We never met.
Cass gets it a lot.
All right, so if Amy says something about that after the meeting to people, if she's even noticed it, which she might not have, if she says something to people, people with very good intentions are likely to say to her, don't make a mountain out of a molehill. That's a small thing, doesn't really matter that much. Pick your battles, it's not worth making a big deal about that. And that's where the second main idea that I want to tell you about comes in, and that's the notion of the accumulation of advantage. What the accumulation of advantage says is mountains are molehills, piled one on top of the other. How do you get to be successful? You get to be successful by parlaying small gains into bigger gains. So if you're not getting your fair share of those small gains, you're not in a position to be able to accumulate them and get larger gains. So it's the message of compound interest applied to the social realm. So you want to put your money in a bank where even if you only get 0.25% more, you're going to get it because you know over time it compounds and it's going to put you ahead. There's a computer simulation that demonstrates this. It simulates an 8-level hierarchical organization, and it starts out with an equal number of males and females. That's a computerized fiction, they're just zeros and ones, but we can call them X's and Y's. And then it institutes a promotion process that takes an individual from one level to the next level of the hierarchy. And that promotion process is biased against women to a degree that accounts for 1% of the variability in determining who's going to go to the next level. So it is a tiny, tiny effect, an effect that pretty much any institution would be very happy to call its own. They run this promotion process until they've completely turned over the organization, and the top is now 65% female. So this tiny amount of bias accumulates over time to produce a mountain of difference. So that's just assuming you're starting out equal and there's only a tiny amount of bias in determining who gets promoted. So these small things that we tend not to pay much attention to and that we tend to encourage other people not to pay attention to are actually mounting up. So Cass is being seen as somebody with good ideas and will be paid more attention to in the future. Amy is ignored and she will be ignored even more in the future. So we see this rising, this increasing disparity in how well the genders are doing. So that's my two-part explanation. We all have schemas, and I could tell you about a lot of experiments that demonstrate that both men and women undervalue women in professional context and overvalue men. And we do that in many small ways throughout the day. And that adds to the growing disparity that we see between male and female careers. The worst thing about this is that everybody has good intentions. Most people have good intentions. They want to do the right thing. Worse, they believe they are doing the right thing. So when I go to different schools and talk, one of the things that senior administrators tend to say is, I don't care who it is, I just want the best person. I don't care if they're black, white, or purple polka dotted. I just want the best person. And recent work in psychology suggests that that belief in our own good intentions leaves us freer to do the wrong thing than if we were skeptical about our good intentions. So one study that was carried out, this is now a while ago, it was when Obama was running for president. People were asked to say who they were endorsing for president, either Obama or McCain, and then they were asked to read a scenario about a community that needed a new police chief. And this was a community that had experienced racial tensions. And then they were asked to say whether they thought it should be an African-American police chief, a white police chief, or it didn't matter. So the people who had endorsed Obama were more likely to pick a white police chief than were the people who had endorsed McCain. So the underlying psychology seems to be, I know I'm not a racist because I'm gonna vote for Obama. So that leaves me free to indulge my more racist instincts here. I can be confident I'm not being racist in thinking a white person would be a better police chief. It's just how things are, and what they don't see is that if they'd endorsed McCain, they would be less likely to have done that. They've done similar experiments with respect to gender. So if you reject a lot of obviously sexist comments about women, then you're less likely to think that a woman should be hired for a stereotypically masculine job. So psychologists call this moral licensing, and I think it's something that should make us all humble. We think we're doing the right thing because we're very aware of our good intentions. And those very good intentions can lead us astray. And this comes up in evaluation settings of all kinds. So it comes up, for example, when students are evaluating faculty. They evaluate male faculty more favorably than they evaluate female faculty. There's a great website that Benjamin Schmidt has at Northeastern University. He analyzes, you can analyze Rate My Professor evaluations. So depending on whether the person evaluated is male or female, you can put in any word. So brilliant, for example, and it shows you by field and by gender who's rated brilliant. So philosophers, and it won't surprise you to know that a philosopher was one of the people who did a study related to this. Philosophers are seen as particularly brilliant. Accountants are seen as not brilliant. But in every field, men are seen as more brilliant than women by the students. And you can also put in other words like kind and nice. Those are seen as more common for women. You can put in mean, that is also more common for women. So women who violate the niceness demand by being strict are more likely to be seen as mean than men who are strict are. So it's a lot of fun, and speaking of fun, you can put in funny, and men are funnier than women in every field. Which is someone who likes to think she's funny is not very reassuring. Okay, so we've got a lot of examples. Many of them are small. Those small things matter. Now, what can we do about it? Okay, so there are some things you can do as individuals, and then there are things that you can do with respect to policies and procedures that you have. Now, I don't know very much about how architecture firms work, so you will have to educate me there. But in terms of things that you can do on your own, you can educate yourself about schemas, which you have not done. You can check that off. It's so great. And there is some evidence that education helps. A recent study by Chang and colleagues found that people's attitudes did change when they got solid science-based information about gender and its effects. And people who were already interested in making a change were more likely to go on to make changes. People who weren't initially interested in making a change moved to having better attitudes. So there's some suggestion that having good attitudes is a preparation for doing good behavior. Okay, so educate yourself. Then be alert to schemas in action. Are women or people of color being ignored in meetings that you have? And someone suggested that you have a lot of conference rooms that you can look into, and you can see who's in charge by who's standing up, who's talking the most. You could do something about that. You could change who is talking a lot. And we do know, my little example is true more generally. Men talk more than women do, contrary perhaps to a belief that you might have. Men interrupt more than women do, and women allow themselves to be interrupted more than men do. So be alert to schemas in action and do something about them. For example, if Amy's point is not being paid attention to, but you think it's a good point, you can say, oh, or even if you don't, even if you think it's a terrible point, you can say, could we discuss Amy's point? It's worth discussing. So that she's acknowledged and her contribution is acknowledged. Third thing, look at women when you are talking to them. So this seems like kind of a minor thing and maybe even kind of an obvious thing, but men tend not to look at women when women are talking. Outside of a courtship situation, men do look at women. But in an ordinary conversation, men look more when they're talking than when they're listening, and women look equally whether they're talking or listening. This is somewhat culture bound. Not all cultures use eye gaze as a way of indicating respect, but in this culture, looking at someone when they're talking is a way of being deferential to them. I remember one time I have twice talked to chemists, chairs of chemistry departments, and after one of my talks, one of the male chemists came up to me and shook my hand and said, okay, so I'm you, right? That was an excellent talk, and I've read your book. And I say, thank you. Okay, so why can't he look at me? Really not clear. What some men have told me is they feel like they're giving something away by looking at women when women are talking. And they are, they're giving their attention away, and their interest. So, look at women and people of color when you're talking to them, whether you're a man or a woman. Promote civility, so make sure that your discussions are civil discussions. Review your colloquium and invited speaker list, and nominate women for prizes and awards. Okay, those are some of the things you can do as an individual. My colleague Abigail Stewart and I have a book we published last year called An Inclusive Academy, Achieving Diversity and Excellence, and that may be helpful to you. In the book, we focus on policies and procedures. So the very first thing is data. How many of you know, well, I know that most of you didn't know the statistics about men and women in architecture, and my guess is you don't know about the statistics of men and women at Grimshaw. So you probably don't know what the average salary is that people are making in different ranks. You probably don't know how long people stay in rank. You probably don't know what your applicant pool for positions is like. Those are all things that you can learn and track and be transparent about. So the first thing is data. Who's here? How much money are they making? What rank do they have? And by here, I mean Grimshaw globally, because that's your thing, right? Grimshaw.global. So it's worldwide. So number one is get the data. Number two is think about universal design, and that's where my antagonism toward these stools comes in. This is not universal design. This is not universal design. This is made for people who look like Cass. You're never gonna sit in the front row. Yes, especially if women are talking.
Yeah,
Okay, so this is not universal design, this is made for men, and I hope the next time I come in here that kitchen is gonna look different than it does now. But that's just one kind of universal design. Another kind of universal design is thinking about how you treat people. So you want to treat people the same, we all agree about that, but the sameness with which you treat them needs to be enlarged by thinking about the differences among the people that you're treating. I'll give you one example of this. At one of the universities that I spoke at, people were talking about people who were, say, 3 years away from tenure. Some of them were not gonna make it. They said, when we tell women they aren't gonna make it, they get incredibly upset and they're likely to leave because they take the message too seriously. And when we tell men that they're not on track, they just blow it off. So should we respond differently? Should we talk to men and women differently when we want to tell them that they're not on track? And our view is no. You treat them the same, but you take into account the differences in how they are likely to respond. So what we suggest in that particular case is you say to people, right now, you're not on track. We want to help you get on track. So we want to meet with you in a month and go over your plan so that you'll be on track and be in a good position to get tenure. So that tells the woman, yes, you want her to be there and you're going to help her by helping her with a plan. And it tells the man, we're serious about this, we want to see you in a month with your plan. So you want to treat everybody the same while taking into account the differences in the people that you're dealing with. So that's something that could loom large in a firm like an architecture firm.
Sorry, I didn't understand the vote off. Maybe I misheard it.
You didn't understand?
The man reacting, voting off.
Oh, blowing it off.
Blowing it off.
Right.
Sorry.
Sorry.
Blowing it off.
Blowing it off, thinking, no, I'm gonna make it. Okay, so those are a couple of examples. So you want the data, you want to know how your policies might be having differential impact, and to what extent your policies are not even clear, written down policies. At Hunter a few years ago, we did a climate survey, and we asked people about their knowledge of policies and procedures. And as a kind of joke, we had as one of the options, what policies and procedures? And to our dismay, the majority of people picked that option. So people need to know what the policies and procedures are. They need to think that those policies and procedures are fair. So work on people's perception of fairness in the workplace finds that outcome fairness, how much money you make, what rank you have, that's important, but less important than procedural fairness. Having policies and procedures that people believe are fair. And then the third kind of fairness is interactional fairness, so-called, it's kind of a funny name, meaning how you treat people. Are you treating people respectfully in your day-to-day interactions with them? And that turns out to have an enormous impact on people's productivity and their happiness in the workplace. So those are things that you can change. Holding people accountable is another principle having to do with policy. So some people here are presumably responsible for promoting other people. I don't know who those people are. So whoever Cass reports to needs to hold you.
Amy.
If only, right? Needs to hold that person accountable for making sure that people are treated equitably, that people are promoted appropriately, that people are assigned tasks that allow them to grow in the firm. So you may or may not currently have a way of establishing who's doing what kind of task. But if you do establish it, you might discover that your tasks are unnecessarily gender separated, that women are tending to do some kinds of jobs and men are tending to do other kinds of jobs when there's no real justification for that. One thing we know is that women tend to get asked more to do work that is service work, that does not allow them to advance in whatever field they're in. And women accept the request to do more service work at greater rates than men do. So all of those are policies that you can change by looking at where in the organization is it possible for there to be gender differences or ethnicity differences. I notice you are not a terribly diverse firm with respect to race and ethnicity. And that, I don't know what that reflects as far as people having degrees. So there are a lot of things that you can do as an individual, and there are a lot of things that you can do as a global organization to make the organization a fairer, better place to work. Thank you.
I think what we're gonna do now is.
Yes, yes,
Okay,
absolutely.
she's gotta run to another class, right?
I have a lab meeting.
Okay. But for maybe 10 minutes, if anybody has any questions that they would like to ask, we would love to open it up to the floor. And actually, if you just talk loud enough, everybody can hear you in this mic, so. Juan?
Yeah, so when you time to throw out Amy and Kaz,
Yeah.
my question is, if
Well, we can't hear you.
if somebody else is in that meeting and notices that Amy said it, nobody paid attention, Cass said it later, suddenly there was a big debate, is it on us as the third party to say, well, yeah, that's, Amy said that earlier, and Cass, takes that point further and bring Amy back into the
Yes, yes.
original,
That-
so it's our responsibility or
Yes.
duty, in fact.
Yes, exactly. It's your responsibility and your duty. And your privilege. And, what's your name? Oh, Juan, right? Okay, so. So you don't have to be a man to do it. Women can do it also. So one of the things we know about credentialing and legitimizing people is that women can do it successfully as well as men. Yes?
I have a question, and again, I don't know if this is personal or policy, but I have I get interrupted a lot. And I'm
What's
not,
your name?
my name is Patty.
Patty,
Patty,
okay.
in meetings, and I actually have done some data, and I get 3 words out on average before I'm interrupted. So I don't usually get the thought out, but I guess my question is normally when that happens, I say, please let me finish. Please let me finish, please let me finish. But I'll only say that 3 times before I just assume that nobody really wants to hear this,
Mhm.
or this wouldn't be going on. So my question is, so that technique of asking to be allowed to finish doesn't really work. So what would be a technique when you're interrupted, if you really think that you have something valuable to say, but normally what I do, I just assume that, okay, they don't think it's valuable, so I just shut up. Eventually, after trying a couple times, what is it?
Yeah.
What is a technique whereby I can share what I think is valuable input, or I wouldn't be saying it?
Right. Did everybody hear the question? Okay. I think it's really tough, and I think engaging somebody else who's going to support you would be one thing to do, but also maybe please let me finish. You could maybe be a little more assertive than that by saying, hold on, I'm not finished yet, and then going on. You could try it, write me and see how it works. So I think the please let me finish, although it's very polite, may not do the job in the context that you're talking about, and puts too much of the power in the hands of the people who are interrupting you. Whereas, hold on, I'm not finished, said in a nice way. I think I said it in a nice way. Do people agree? Okay, so in a nice way that makes your authority clear, that might work better. Maybe people have other suggestions. Yeah,
I mean, well, I'm just thinking that maybe one approach would be to say, you know, I'll be very interested to hear what you think, but I'd like to finish what I was just saying first. You know, maybe like kind of making them more aware of themselves and then bringing it back to you. But I mean, I feel like it's probably a thing you have to experiment with.
yeah. So obviously, please let me finish isn't working, so trying a few other things might be better.
I think you mentioned like an ally, which I think
Yes.
is really useful to have, especially in teams and meetings. Do you have any allies in your career that you felt like showed you the way, or do you feel like a trailblazer beating down the doors of policy?
So I actually almost never think about gender.
Did you just say that we shouldn't say that?
That's a dangerous thing.
So I'm really interested in it from a psychological framework, understanding why is this happening. But I don't tend a lot to think about my own position there. So I guess I would say no, nobody showed me the way, and B, I never felt like a trailblazer. I felt like I could understand, I could learn to understand what was going on, but I never felt like a trailblazer. Yeah,
Been a couple of heated discussions about positive discrimination in these kind of forums. I just wanted to kind of get your thoughts, or whether there's research on, actively trying to address that imbalance by positively discriminating.
yes, so I think that term, positive discrimination, I think that is so objectionable. And it's not so much an American term, it's more a British term, I think,
Can you
whereas,
describe what that is?
so it's affirmative action.
Oh, okay.
But people also misinterpret affirmative action in its original framework, which was if you have two candidates who are equal, then you give the preference to the person who is going to make your organization more diverse. So you give it to the woman, or you give it to the person of color, or whatever. But affirmative action was never meant to mean that you would hire someone who was not capable and competent. Now, that said, in other cultures than this one, there have been experiments, as in Norway, with putting in quotas. Americans go like this when they hear the word quota, like, no, we just won't ever have quotas, and I think we won't ever. But Norway instituted a rule that all companies' boards of directors had to have at least 40% women. And I haven't kept up on what's happened as a result of that, but the Scandinavian countries can do things that the United States and Britain, I think, just can't do. And even France supposedly has what they call parité, meaning the political parties have to have equal numbers of male and female candidates fielded, but they haven't done that, and they just pay the fine. So the fine isn't a really big fine, so they just pay the fine and get out of it. So I think in this country, realistically speaking, it's not a good idea to have a rule that says, we must have a certain number of people from any particular category. But I think it does make sense to say, half of the architecture degrees go to women. Our firm, when we advertise for a job, we're only getting, in our applicant pool, 25% women. I don't know what the case is, but say that was the case. We're doing something wrong. We're not appealing enough to women. We're not putting our ads in the right place. We're not going to schools and talking to women in architecture groups and demonstrating that our firm is friendly to women.
Too much Star Wars.
Too many Star Wars posters, yeah. So I think you want to know what the data are nationally, you want to know what your pool is, you want your applicant pool to resemble the availability pool. And then you want to look at how you're assessing people. So you want to track, does the percentage of women in your pool change as you go through the procedures that you've got for evaluating people? Are you unnecessarily weighting some criteria higher than others? Or worse, do you change your criteria depending on whether the person is male or female? So there are a lot of things you can do procedurally that will make things fairer, that don't require you to, as you put it, positively discriminate. So I think we don't want to discriminate, period, but we want to make sure that we're taking everybody's talent into account.
Can I just address that, because, I mean, we have been confronted with that question for a number of years. And I think that if you accept that there might be attributes that are gender specific, either through learning or through society, there are times when the needs of an organization actually, I think, extend beyond perhaps the fairness of the individual under consideration. So I would say, for example, that when you look at the leadership of our practice, we obviously skew very heavily male and Caucasian male. To the extent that it's unfair for an individual to be discriminated against, I would frame it more that we're looking for an attribute that needs to be put into place in leadership to form a culture that is more representative, more balanced for our future. So, to me, that's a dilemma that we've been facing for some time. It's the potential injury to an individual in favor for progressive and right direction for society and for a business, which is to have a greater representation that reflects the society we're in.
So,
And so one further comment on that.
Yeah.
Apologies for interrupting you. To me, it comes down a little bit towards also trying to find the appropriate balance of leadership attributes and traits. And whether I'm right or not, I'm not sure, but the evidence that I've seen suggests that historically those attributes have been fundamentally male-dominated, and now we need to revise that.
okay, thank you for your contribution. So I think I am not going to accept your assumption, which is that the individuals, what's best for the individual, where we've got a lot of them, is necessarily at odds with what's best for the firm. So that's one thing I'm going to question. The second thing I'm going to question is the idea that leadership is all one way. And to the extent that there are data, and the data I think are somewhat squishy, the characteristics that people associate with so-called transformational leadership are characteristics that men and women have to the same degree. And some of those characteristics, like shows individualized concern for others, are things that women turn out to have more of than men do. So I'm not sure that you're right in what you're saying about how those attributes are distributed with respect to gender.
I'm trepidatious, I'm not sure I'm right either.
Okay.
I'm familiar with the policies in countries and quota system, and some of the positive outcomes that have arisen from that. I think that my lens into our organization is having seen generations of leadership and certainly some of the biases in the way that we would identify what leadership traits are, I think very likely. And so I simply read it in a sufficient amount to convince myself that there are other attributes that we've been bereft of. I'd also furthermore say that until we have far better and more equitable representation, whether it be BAME or gender, in the senior most positions, we are never going to be as healthy as we should be as an organization. And I'm simply making the point that there will be moments where we're confronted, this is a business reality, where a decision has to be made. And I would suggest that the lens of meritocracy, when I suggest that there are attributes that I think we need in leadership, I would favor a female candidate. Because I don't believe you'll ever have a parity of consideration, therefore affirmative action is to choose a female when they're equal. The reality is what you're needing varies at different times, and we need to satisfy that need that we do not change. There's been too many years where we haven't adequately changed with good intention. Your point about the intentions for taking the lead, it isn't enough.
Okay, so I want to make 2 points. The first point is that when people are in leadership positions and their leadership is supported by the organization, they display traits that they might not have displayed in other positions. And so one thing I think that we've seen in the university context with the large NSF institutional transformation awards that have been given to different institutions is they have created female leaders primarily by giving them the opportunity to be in a position of authority and leadership. So I think the assumption that the traits that we associate with men in leadership are really concentrated in men, and that women cannot or will not or do not show those same traits in leadership positions, that could be a misperception due to our primarily seeing women in non-leadership positions. The second thing is, I worry that we entrench beliefs about gender differences by saying, well, we need in leadership some people who are going to be gentler, warmer, whatever. Because maybe what you need in leadership is also some women who are very assertive, but they're not liked so much because they're assertive. So I think questioning what one thinks leadership requires and how best to find it among the people who work for one, that's something that can take a lot of investigation, but I'd encourage you both to look beyond whatever traits people are demonstrating in their non-leadership positions. So a common thing that people say is men are promoted on the basis of promise, and women are promoted on the basis of achievement. So to the extent that we're able to see promise in men, we want to be able also to see promise in women. And so I'd encourage that, and I'd also encourage not pigeonholing people. Even though we know men are penalized if they display stereotypically feminine traits, and women tend to be penalized if they demonstrate stereotypically masculine traits. But that's something that you can talk about as a group and do something about. Now, you have clients, and that's another thing. In the university, our clients are our students, and they're not in the same relation to us that your clients are to you. But my impression has been that clients are becoming more gender fair and ethnicity fair. I don't know if that's true.
And that's certainly been, well, I don't know about anything else, my evidence for sure that is the case. And I think that we are in an industry which is notoriously poor performing in all manner of metrics, and we have clients like where we're ahead of the so we have a significant amount of catch up to do.
Okay, so it's not that there's resistance at the client end.
I think there's so much systemic concerns with respect to the education process, the biases that apply. You may be I apologize, it's the first few minutes, but our graduating classes in universities are generally equal.
Right.
Our intake is generally equal, and then through a whole set of conditions, by the time you get to more senior roles, and you can see the dramatic decrease in the representation of women. Now, with respect to failing individuals or ethnic groups, they don't even get in by and large because of the odd speed stacks that are against their participation in education and other issues that we have to contend with.
Okay, I think there were a couple of other hands that were up. Yes.
Earlier we had that study of the young girls who are with Star Wars,
Yeah.
The way we conveyed it was a dark room, unsettling, I figured that if they're more comfortable in a natural environment to choose computer programming or whatever it was, isn't the opposite true then? That it's about not liking the environment itself, and if men were thrown into a room which is the schema is pink walls and Barbie dolls, etc., they run out in fear. So if you put men into the landscape,
Yeah, so they
what was the
did
outcome of
actually, they did, and there was no difference. So men were equally interested, regardless of whether it was Star Wars or nature posters.
so it's saying well, basically environment should be neutral.
Yes,
All men,
yes,
as
yes,
a sustainability practice and
yeah.
anything.
Yeah, so I think Barbie dolls are going to turn off
Yeah.
an equal percentage of women and men, but the basic thing is people need to feel they have the possibility of belonging, and that's true for everybody. So you want it to be the case that you universalize the possibility of belonging. And so, as I said, yes, and the environment is critical in that. Another experiment that was carried out before that one looked at Stanford students' interest in attending a supposed science workshop in the summer. And they showed people short videos of a supposed previous workshop. And the videos varied in the representation of men and women. So one of them was equal, men and women, and the other one was 2 men to 1 woman. And they looked at a variety of different measures, including physiological arousal. So women showed more arousal, faster heartbeat, in the case where it was an unbalanced representation of men and women, so they were more vigilant. Because it was a somewhat more threatening situation, and they indicated less desire in participating in it than when it was 50-50. Men also indicated less desire in participating, presumably for somewhat different reasons than the women had. But a number of measures suggest that people's interest in being a leader, people's interest in going into a particular field are influenced by subtle cues in the environment about who is this field for, who is this activity for. And if it seems to be for everybody, then people are more interested in participating. Yes?
You know, when I was teaching, I would insist on having gender inclusive language. Also, for example, if we had a meeting, it wasn't the architect and his client, and his engineer, and his,
Yeah.
So, and there's actually a book by Kevin Lynch, the Untitled Chapter talks about how it's switches, and it's really unfortunately jarring, but anyway, so when I was teaching, I insisted on this, and I got, actually, it seemed like I got more flack and more pushback from the females. This is like in their first few years, but I seemed to get more pushback from the females than I did from the males. And why do you think that would be?
Yeah, I don't know, I'm surprised at that. It might be that men felt inhibited from pushing back, and women didn't. So unless you gave them a survey, an anonymous survey, I don't know that you can tell for sure. But I think women also are concerned that they not be portrayed as people who need special accommodations, people who are potential victims, people who are super sensitive. And so depending on what the context was in which you gave a reason for it, that could have affected how women felt about it. So I was, after Why So Slow came out, I was interviewed by Natalie Anger for a piece in the New York Times. They had, on Tuesdays, they used to have this thing, a conversation with, in the science section. And she asked me about whether I had been a victim of gender bias in my own career. And I said, I really don't like that terminology. I don't want to think of myself as a victim, and I think most women don't want to think of themselves as victims, but they do want to have a fair shot. So I don't know exactly how you presented it, but I think women are very concerned that they be seen as deserving the jobs they get on their merit, no special accommodations. And that's another reason, now that I'm thinking of it, that's another reason for emphasizing universality of design. That what we're after here is being as inclusive as possible. And it's not that we're making special accommodations for person X or person Y, rather we're aiming for universality. So that might change things. Right now I have a master's student. We are doing a study on perception of the term guys. And is it gender neutral, and who finds it problematic and who doesn't find it problematic? So I'm very curious about what we're gonna find out there. In the meantime, don't use it.
Sorry, guys. Seriously, my favorite word, so I'll be aware of that.
Okay, I think we're done.
I think we're, yeah, and you've so graciously gone over time. Thank you so much for being here and being our kickoff speaker, and I think it speaks volumes to everybody here who's stayed and watched the whole thing. I really appreciate that. We really are looking forward to, during breakfast and even potentially during tea time, to have more engaging conversations about this. And what a great offer that Grimshaw has allowed somebody like Virginia to come here, a women architecture group, to really set the stage for what we're gonna be talking about in our group. And I'm really appreciative of everybody who's participated, and keep coming.